Hello, everyone, and welcome to Not at the Museum Thursday nights. I'm Sylvia. I'm the Cultural Development Coordinator with the Niagara Falls History Museum. As always, before we begin our evening, I'm going to start with our land acknowledgement. The Niagara region of Ontario is located on the shared territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Chinootan people. The Chinootan people have called this land their home, and until recently, the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee have been sharing this land as one dish, one spoon treaty territory. Tonight, we're going to finish off our Masculinity in the War of 1812 series with Melissa Fowler and her presentation titled, as you see on your page there, Amputating Authority in the Environment of War, Practitioner's Agency in the War of 1812. Before we begin, just to let you know some things, we have a Q&A portion at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions throughout this presentation, please feel free to type in a question. If you're joining us on Facebook, you can also leave a question in the comment section. We could check that, and Melissa can answer that for you at the end of her presentation. So let's get this evening started, and I'm going to hand it over to Melissa.
Okay. Hi, everybody. How's it going? So before we begin, I just wanted to say a quick thank you to the Niagara Falls Museum for giving me the opportunity to share my work with everyone today, to my supervisor, Renee Lafferty-Selhaney, and other Brock faculty who have guided and supported my work over the last couple of years. And finally, to my friends, family, students, coworkers, and everybody else who took the time to come out today on a lovely Thursday evening to listen to me talk about my work. So for anybody who had the chance to watch Jake Bredman's presentation on July 7th, he discussed briefly the idea that you can't study gender history without considering the power dynamics of the time. In my paper, Amputating Authority in the Environment of War, Practitioner's Agency in the War of 1812, this power dynamic is explored through patients and practitioners. I use the term practitioner intentionally instead of physician or doctor, as the 1800s concept of doctors differed greatly from what we understand them to be today. According to historian Roy Porter, we are healthier than ever before, yet more distrustful of doctors and the powers of what may broadly be called the medical system. He and others helped demonstrate that this distrust of practitioners is not exclusive to the 21st century. Sorry, trying to get the slide to change. There we go. So throughout my paper, I argue that the authority of practitioners was challenged by the setting and environment of war as much as it was by masculine concepts of wholeness. Specifically, I look at how medical education, the chaos of war and hospitals, and finally masculinity and wholeness impacted this dynamic. Sorry, give me 1 second. So drawing on primary sources such as journals and diaries from practitioners James Mann and William Beaumont, along with patients like Shadrach Byfield, I'm able to create a more well-rounded view of the medical interactions. As medical historian Roy Porter complained, most medical histories look at progress and advancements in medicine and only the practitioner and don't consider the patient. Moreover, he states that practitioners are put on a pedestal and talked about like great men of the past, rather than, as I suggest, men caught in a larger, more complicated drama. While suggesting that we speak of patients as sufferers or the sick, some of whom opted to put themselves in relation with medical practitioners, his argument doesn't consider that soldiers had little control over their situation and the extenuating circumstances of battle, which often forced injured and sick soldiers into these medical encounters. Along with medical history, this paper considers histories of gender, specifically masculinity, disability, sensory histories, and war, through reference to historians like Natalie Davis, Renee Lafferty-Selhaney, Anna Carden-Coyne, Jared Orsi, and Erin O'Connor, to name a few. With few exceptions, gender and issues of masculinity overall are only now beginning to influence the study of war. But few histories have incorporated masculinity, medicine, disability, sensory history, and war together, meaning that this paper had to draw from sources outside of the War of 1812 as well. In the first part of my paper, I discussed the importance of medical education and how this impacted public perceptions of medicine and had an effect on the authority of practitioners. As we consider the setting of the medical interaction, either in peacetime or wartime, we see differences in the acceptance of medical treatment and trust given to practitioners. By providing context for the medical education of practitioners, it is easier to understand why patients in peacetime or non-life-threatening situations were reluctant to seek or accept help from trained practitioners. Looking at the medical landscape and understanding the medicine in the early 1800s, it is clear that the profession of medicine is still emerging, which enables distrust and issues of authority to persist. As Ackroyd et al. Suggests, 1750 to 1850 was a crucial period in the development of the modern profession. And these changes were important to medicine as well, because the challenges to authority we see during the war were intricately linked to public beliefs in their own ability to self-heal and the general lack of professionalized medicine. Historians Thomas Bonner and Roy Porter both describe early 19th century patients as infrequent users of practitioners' skills. As medical knowledge and education in the early 19th century was not yet standardized, traditional knowledge, herbal medicines, and medical texts like Buchan's Domestic Medicine, which details many of these traditional methods, provided the average literate citizen with enough information to heal themselves. And we see this trend in self-healing and resistance to medical authority bleeding into the battlefield to some extent as well. Although organizations such as the College of Surgeons and College of Physicians attempted to control and organize practitioners, they were not overly effective at this time and died out quickly, but they were able to return more successfully following the War of 1812. Because practitioners were at odds with one another, patients were distrustful of the field due to the lack of any specialized medical knowledge or authority in the field. James Mann noted that an opinion prevailed among the soldiers that ardent spirits was a sovereign remedy for complaints of the bowel. It was not infrequent to find a patient on the first visit highly excited, even to the point of intoxication, by these inebriated draughts. What this suggests is that soldiers were self-healing when possible prior to attending the hospital, thus alluding to the lack of trust and more common use of practitioners in peacetime and wartime in some cases as a last resort. Until the War of 1812 in America, most aspiring medical practitioners like James Mann would have learned their trade through apprenticeships with practicing surgeons or physicians. As in Europe, where anatomy was becoming increasingly important to the field, surgeons were still considered different to physicians, who were largely trained in medical theories rather than hands-on practice. In peacetime, most surgeons' practice was limited because of the dangers of surgery itself, as well as the fact that it had to be conducted without anesthesia. For many, military experiences gave them the most extensive training in surgical technique. According to Anna Carden-Coyne, surgical skills were often gained through unavoidable reality of practicing on mass casualties and learning from colleagues in the field. Without clearly defined and specialized knowledge, which Catherine Kelly attributes to gains in medical authority, untrained practitioners were able to maintain their practice with little to no medical knowledge, enabling them to challenge the authority of medically educated physicians and surgeons. Sorry, lost my spot. Sorry, there we go. As we consider the education of practitioners, it is also important to look at their medical understandings of illness and disease. During the early 19th century, miasma theory was the most common understanding of the body. Miasma theory was the understanding that miasmas, or bad air filled with noxious gases, caused diseases and illness in the body, which were thought to be imbalanced or overexposed to these miasmas. Miasmas were often thought to be found around marshes, swamps, excessive heat or excessive cold climates, and any sort of decay. So environments like war would have been prime targets for this type of environment that would have been exciting causes that were to be avoided. So frequent treatment to cure illnesses in and out of war involved dramatic interventions, often called heroic medicine. So along with recommending changes to the patient's surroundings by avoiding where these miasmas were, doctors would have forced bodies back into balance, or so they thought, through techniques such as bleeding or chemically induced purges. So the standard heroic treatment that we often see in Mann and others' writing did not necessarily provide cures for these illnesses or diseases, but the discomfort and the visible signs of reaction were believed to be evidence that the treatment was working. As Rosenberg suggests, patients often demanded treatments that produce these visible signs of the body rebalancing. From the treatments described by Mann, Beaumont, and Parson, all of whom served as practitioners during the War of 1812, it is clear that they had limited options for healing based on contemporary medical understandings and surgical capabilities. Instead, they placed heavy reliance on topical and oral treatments, many of which were poisonous or downright disgusting. While surgery in the early 19th century was restricted to a few minimal invasive procedures, such as removing bullets from under the skin or removing teeth, amputation was the main surgery that took place in and out of war. With considerations for the lack of effective anesthesia, amputation would have been brutal to endure, with most men passing out from the pain. As you can see, if you visit the old Fort Erie, surgical tools would have often been primitive at best, with most practitioners' chest having essentially a common hacksaw, which would not have always been sharp, and using these to cut through bones to remove the limb and trying to tie up ligaments and create a stump afterwards. However, according to Mann, the surgery was equally challenging for practitioners. He states that it required considerable strength and firmness to carry the knife through the thick muscles and firm tendons at one stroke, he wrote. While subtly hinting at his own strength and prowess here, Mann also points to some of the issues with the procedure, including additional pain caused by poorly trained and weak surgeons. As we can see in Charles Bill's images, these are going to be kind of gross, so just a heads up, if you're a little squeamish, maybe look away for this one. Practitioners put fingers deep in the body, sometimes to pull out bullets lodged under the skin, other times to stop bleeding while they performed amputations. With patients being plied with alcohol to ease the pain during amputation, the surgeon's chief contribution to the patient's comfort was speed. Kaufman also notes that despite amputation being the most common procedure during the war, if practitioners were required to perform capital or life-threatening operations, such as an amputation or the treatment of gunshot wounds, the men's expectation of survival must have been very slim. With these high death rates in and out of war, undoubtedly it contributed to a lack of trust in practitioners, and as we will see, it exacerbated during the chaos of war. So moving to consider the chaos of war, the idea of masculinity is an undercurrent of the challenges to authority that we see play out in military hospitals during battles. And sensory historian Mark Smith describes war as hell on the senses. As Mary Gillette informs us, the standing army had faded after the American Revolution, and the War of 1812 was largely fought by militia and volunteer soldiers, many of whom had poor training. Even Massachusetts physician James Mann, who served in the Northern Army during the war, knew that no preparations or for even defensive operations had been made, leaving much to be desired in his perspective by way of the medical department and hospitals. Even before the fighting began, this lack of preparation and hasty call to arms had direct impacts on the ability of practitioners like Mann to prevent illness and care for the wounded. Looking at military hospitals, British practitioner William Tiger Dunlop described his hospital at Fort Erie as a ruinous fabric built of logs called Butler's Barrack. Nothing could be worse contrasted for a hospital for wounded men. There was a great want for room, so that many had to be laid on straw on the floor. These practitioners seemed well aware of the poor quality of their hospitals that the military was providing them, and worried that those receiving treatment would be made worse by the impact of the climate and environment. Unfortunately, there was not much that could be done, and so they were forced to work with what they were given. In addition to poor hospital conditions, there was a general lack of medical personnel, which had direct impacts on practitioners' ability to deal with mass casualties coming in. This only helped perpetuate the distrust in practitioners, and not surprisingly, we see military hospitals on land or on sea described as the graves of an army. As Mann goes on to discuss, medical personnel were granted no rank nor command in the Army, and there was little practitioners could do to override officers' authority over their patients. In an environment that ran on the hierarchies of rank, the lack of one was yet another blow to the authority of practitioners during the War of 1812. Mann also alluded to the oft-noted displays of honor, strength, and unyielding courage of practitioners during war. In drawing upon these displays of courage and sacrifice, Mann attempted to garner sympathies for practitioners' authority by addressing their equal, if not more significant, contribution to the war effort. As reference to a soldier's honor, strength, and courage was not uncommon, it played a role in interpreting manliness and authority for this paper. Overall, the hospital setting, which was unquestionably gruesome at times, demonstrates how medical authority suffered because the environment could further poor public perceptions of the practitioner. If you have moved away because of the gross pictures, you can come back. So looking at, oh, I lost my spot again. Sorry. So as we see with physician William Beaumont's experience during the explosion at the Battle of York in 1813, the chaos of war could sometimes demonstrate some medical authority. He writes, "The groans of the wounds and agony of the dying were to be heard. The surgeons wading in blood, cutting of arms, legs, and trepanning heads to rescue the fellow creatures from untimely death, to hear the poor creatures crying, 'Oh dear, oh my God, do, doctor, do cut off my leg, my arm, my head, to relieve me from misery. I can't live, would have rent the heart of steel and shocked the insensibility of the most hardened assassin and cruelest savage. It awakened my liveliest sympathy, and I cut and lashed for 48 hours, without food or sleep. My God, a head and a body ground in pieces without having his very heart pierced with the acutest sensibility and his blood chill in his veins.' This moment in the midst of battle demonstrates that medical authority prevailed during the chaos, where pain and sensory overload overtook resistance to treatment. Moreover, how he described it suggests that a sense of heroism and a need to demonstrate his own manliness to some extent. Also, in this instance, we see Beaumont being provided the authority to amputate and effectively unman the wounded soldier rather than being challenged. This idea of unmanning we'll come back to later. But yet all of this would not have surprised physician James Mann. As he explained, when practitioners recommended amputation, they experienced the least resistance in situations that were life or death and where the patient could be persuaded of his imminent demise. In contrast, during less life or death situations, patients would refuse care, specifically transfers to general hospitals, which could offer much better service and higher potential for survival. It would seem that these men were influenced by their sense of duty and brotherhood. As Mary Gillette suggests, patients would rather die where they were and under the care of those physicians that they were acquainted with than be transferred to the care of a practitioner they did not know. Therefore, I conclude that the environment and chaos, which were in part responsible for the success or failure to achieve medical authority. Jeez, that slide. Finally, in considering disability, I draw on ideas of wholeness and how it was connected to manliness. According to American ideals of manhood in the 1800s, injured soldiers who were missing limbs were seen as incomplete, weak, and dependent, which would have created difficult circumstances for soldiers returning home to a place that no longer considered them whole. Amputation being again the most common treatment in the midst of chaos, and even afterwards, amputation was seen as the cause of unmanning, and as such faced with resistance for reasons beyond just the medical interaction or pain. Recalling that at the beginning of this talk, I mentioned Porter's argument to examine more than just the practitioners in medical history, this section on disability easily draws on the patient and helps connect medical authority with manliness. With manhood being linked to a man's capability to participate in war and provide for his family, we see through amputation cases and the resistance to amputation that it was as much based on fear and chaos as it was the idea of wholeness. As Anna Carden-Coyne suggests, fit soldiers were important weapons whose utility had to be maintained. In cases of amputation, soldiers could no longer serve a purpose for the military and were sent home. Shadrach Byfield, a British Light Company soldier, explained in his memoir that he deprived of my trade in consequence of losing my arm in the service. It was with great difficulty I could support my wife and children in a respectable manner. As Sarah Hadley Cousins notes, existing narratives of disabled soldiers describe them as maimed or broken, which more clearly suggests their deviant status in contemporary society, compared to more inclusive words like altered or changed. Mann exemplifies the use of this terminology and the importance of wholeness, as he noted that a maimed arm is preferable to no arm, if only for its appearance. From this, we can see that on top of the visual expectation of men's bodies to be whole, to adhere to the image of a man, a maimed, useless limb was still preferable to nothing, as war injuries were imbued with ideas about patriotic sacrifice. And while Teresa Michaels argues some soldiers felt a sense of pride from their injuries, the vision of disabled soldiers contradicted the image of heroic, courageous soldiers and masculinity. Michaels further states that disabled men were represented as helpless, an image of physical vulnerability compounded by economic dependence. Unfortunately, as mentioned previously, amputation was one of the most common surgeries during the War of 1812, and due to the lack of staffing and general chaos, as Mann notes, a patient is willing to submit to extreme distress for the sake of a limb if there is a distant prospect of saving it. Given the challenges faced by soldiers returning home, the resistance to medical authority in this context makes sense and was clearly influenced by the concept and visual ideas of masculinity. In conclusion, I suggest that ideas of wholeness, which are impacted by manliness, in addition to the chaotic environment of war and education of practitioners, collectively impacted medical authority. Moreover, cases of amputation provide a place to examine the gendered impact on medical interactions and perceptions of disability. As Mann noted, patients would sometimes go to extreme lengths in order to maintain their masculinity and wholeness rather than accept medical authority and advice. As few historians have considered the authority of practitioners during this period, and with indications that the period coincided with shifts in medical professionalization, it is a topic that has further research possibilities. While I have attempted here to introduce a sensory and gendered lens to medical authority and medicine in the early 19th century, more could be done to apply either of these lenses to medical history. So coming to the end of my talk, I just want to say a big thanks again to the Niagara Falls Museum for hosting the speaker series on masculinity and the War of 1812, and say a thanks to my co-speakers, Jake Bredman and Caitlin Carter for the great series and interesting talks. So I hope you have all learned something through all of our talks today, and at some point take some time to visit the Niagara Falls Museum.
Thank you very much, Melissa.
Thanks.
That was really, really interesting. I do have one question here.
Yep.
How could more exploration into the War of 1812 through a sensory lens impact discussions on masculinity?
So one of the sources that I didn't get to talk too much about today was a drummer named Jarvis Hanks. And Jarvis Hanks, his experience was very sensory. He talks about the loud booms of hearing explosions and things like that. And so because we're seeing him speaking during the moments of chaos, which I had alluded to throughout my paper, that moment of chaos and the perceptions of it compared to maybe reactions that we would see after the fact of people talking about, oh, that battle, was it as loud as we imagine, things like that. I think the sensory side of it really helps us kind of pull into the sense of masculinity, that sense of courage, especially. So anybody looking to do anything more about courage, that would be like a good avenue to explore, like kind of the interplay of masculinity and and sensory and war, which haven't had a lot of attention lately. So I know that myself, I'm trying to look at sensory history a little bit more, being such a new field. It was something that towards the end of me doing my paper, I had started to try and incorporate a little bit more and try and research a little bit more, but it just didn't make it in the way that I had hoped to. But I think it has a lot of possibilities for learning more about, that sense of masculinity and courage, utilizing the sensory history as a different lens.
Okay, so we have a couple more questions. This one's from Caitlin. Excellent presentation, Melissa. I'm thinking of major figures like Lord Nelson, who lost his arm but seemed to maintain a masculine status. Do you think men could overcome the unmanning of disability? And if so, how do you think they accomplish this?
So I did actually look at Nelson as well a little bit. And his was a very particular case because he was able to kind of get away from that image of weakness that is associated with that loss of limb and that disability. I think perhaps in his case, maybe the needs of the time and his status as an officer compared to, just a regular soldier, maybe that could have played into it as well. I think as far as I can recall anyways, I think he was offered to do some more clerical work instead or something and kind of get off the battlefield, but decided to go back anyways. I could be wrong there, Caitlin, correct me, but as far as I know, I think, he was one of the outliers, I guess, of this kind of a situation. So not to say that it's not possible, but I think most cases it's few and far between.
Okay, so we have another question and comment from Jake. Amazing job, Melissa. Did you have a favorite primary source that you read for this research? And for those interested in further study of surgery, medicine, and the War of 1812, what are some future research avenues?
So the main reason that I actually went to Brock was because of my primary source. So I found this primary source. It was actually James Mann's medical journals. And that served as, the bulk of my primary source research. It's about 600 pages. So it's quite extensive, but he really goes through a lot of different pieces of medicine. And because of his status as essentially like the general of the medical department at the beginning of the War of 1812, then he is able to kind of really call into how the departments are running, the access to sources and things like that they need. And he can see the whole chaotic mess that it is right from the get-go. And so he was a really excellent source to be able to kind of dig into medicine and get those ideas of what amputation looks like, how are they treating people, things like that. So that was initially what kind of drew me into the topic to begin with, and was something that kind of just carried through. But another one would be Charles Bell's pictures, which I included a couple of them in the slideshow, and they are gruesome, they are graphic, but like they're drawings, so it's not the worst thing you've probably ever seen. But just that sense of pain that you see on their faces was really interesting. And being able to then utilize that to look at it from an amputation and then a disability standpoint for me was kind of interesting. Other ones I can think of. There's a handful. I read a lot of things, but I will say, I guess those two kind of stuck out as being like the most interesting, I guess, of if you're looking for medicine and you're looking to get the nitty gritty of things, those were some pretty good sources, I think, to call on. And William Beaumont also has some really great journals that are awesome as well. But again, most of my sources were looking at the American side of the war compared to the British. So I'm not sure what the British side of this would look like as much. It's likely it's very similar. a lot of what Catherine Kelly has written has kind of justified for me that there was a lot of medical information that was being transferred, between Europe and, the Americas. And so likely there was enough transfer of medical knowledge that they probably experienced similar issues as well. But as far as I know, the sourcing for that is a little more scarce. So I would be interested to see kind of the same topics through a British lens instead of the American lens that I inadvertently took. When I started this project, I had no intention of it being a American-based thing, given, Canada and everything, but that's how it worked out with my sources. So I kind of just ran with it, and that's what happened. But yeah, I think those ones are probably pretty good.
That's great. I think we'll end it on this lovely comment from Catherine Fowler, which I'm sure you know.
Yeah.
Wonderful presentation, Melissa. It's nice to hear what you've been working so long for. So love, Mom. So
thanks, Mom.
A nice way to cap it off. So, but thank you to everyone who worked so hard on these presentations, to Jake and Caitlin for the previous evenings that you've done. Thank you, Melissa, for tonight. This was super insightful. Thank you, everyone who showed up to listen tonight. If you're interested, we do more Thursdays. We are doing ones in person. Next Thursday, we have our community art project with our community artist, which is Wayne Moore this year. So if you're in the city, if you're in Niagara Falls, please come by next Thursday. We're doing some painting with the community, so you're all invited. But again, thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you, Melissa, for a wonderful presentation, and have a lovely evening.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.